One of the reasons we're so concerned with mold growth in collections is that mold are attracted to many of the materials that make up the objects in our archives, museums, and libraries. This includes starches, which are found in adhesives, sizing, and cloth, proteins, including leather, parchment, gelatin, animal glues, and photographic emulsions, cellulose, which is part of wood furniture, objects, and frames, and makes up paper and books. Mold also grows in some of the everyday debris which exists in any collection. So this can include things like skin cells, clothing fibers, external dirt, oily secretions like fingerprints, and industrial pollutants. Mold actually causes harm to archival and library materials by landing on a substrate, for example, your book or your paper or your object, and it begins to digest the material components. Mold secretes hydrolytic enzymes in order to break down the substrate into simpler substances, which can then be absorbed by the hyphae for nutrients. And again, those hyphae are those sort of thread-like bits. The resulting degradation weakens materials, and it makes them susceptible to further damage. It also means that they can absorb water more readily, so that means they're exposed to an increase in damage. For example, water emergency or in high humidity. Some molds also contain colored substances that can cause staining even after the mold itself is removed from the object. The color of the powdery stuff, the conidia, does not usually cause the staining. It's usually the pigments which are excreted by the hyphae that penetrates the surface of the heritage objects and causes the colored spots that are harder to remove. So mold will always be in our collections. It's in the air around us, and there's not much we can do about that, or would we probably want to. What we are concerned about is preventing the mold spores which are floating around at this very moment from becoming active and beginning to damage our collections. So in order to know how to control the activation and growth of mold, we have to know what mold likes. Mold has fairly basic requirements to become active, and two of the most important factors are the availability of an organic substrate and a source of moisture. And there are other things which we'll talk about that affect mold growth, but those are the sort of primary things you have to have: organic material and a source of moisture. Some of the other factors that affect the ability of mold to grow and thrive are temperature, air circulation, pH, availability of nutrients, and light exposure. The availability of moisture is incredibly important for mold to grow and flourish. It's probably the number one thing that you need. Mold requires a moisture source to grow, to produce enzymes that break down the substrate it lands on in order to obtain nutrients, and it also requires moisture in order to reproduce. Often when we talk about moisture levels in heritage collections, we think about relative humidity of the air. High relative humidity is an important factor to encourage mold growth, but actually the moisture content of the substrate the mold is growing on is also an important factor. And this can actually help explain why two different types of material in the same environment can have different outcomes. So one can become moldy while the other doesn't. I'm sure you've all seen this in your refrigerator at home. For fungal decomposition of a substrate to occur, the moisture content of that substrate must be at least 20%. However, relative humidity in the environment that your collections are stored in above 70% increases the likelihood of mold growth. At the same time, the mold will also thrive off of the increased moisture content of the substrate that it's landed on. Some sources of moisture include high relative humidity in the immediate environment, poor air circulation. This can result in pockets of elevated relative humidity within a room, which seems to be otherwise pretty dry. Usually the highest relative humidity area or spot in a room is right next to the coldest surface, which includes windows, near the floor, things like that, against an exterior wall as well. That often can be the coldest spot. So that will be the location where condensation begins to form, which can then lead to mold growth. Obviously, water from a flood or as a result of an activated fire suppression system can result in mold growth, and so can water from aqueous conservation treatments. Most mold will grow at temperatures between 59 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit. However, mold growth can occur between 40 degrees Fahrenheit and 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature that mold prefers, for lack of a better word, can vary based on different factors, but generally it's around 86 degrees Fahrenheit. Mold can lie dormant at sub-zero temperatures, and that's why we recommend freezing as one course of action for dealing with a mold outbreak. However, there is a misconception that freezing kills spores. Actually, it kills them. So you put something in the freezer and the mold is dead. Unfortunately, it's not the case. Activated or germinating conidia or spores can be killed by freezing or extremes in temperature. However, if the mold spores or the conidia are deactivated, they just become dormant under the same conditions. So they're still there. If you take something out of the freezer and put it back into an environment with high humidity, for example, that mold will begin growing. So freezing is only one step in the process, and then you move on to actually physically removing it. But we'll talk about that as we go along. Air movement is very important, not only for regulating pockets of high relative humidity in a space. Air circulation also increases the evaporation and drying of moisture. All things being equal, good ventilation and air circulation can actually mean the difference between a mold bloom occurring on an object or not. Mold prefers a pH of 6. That's optimum for most of the mold species that we deal with on our collections. So this means that mold prefers a substrate which is just slightly acidic. pH of 7 is neutral, so pH of 6 just crosses into acidic territory. Mold gains the nutrients it needs to grow and thrive from the substrate that it lands on. Mold produces enzymes which break down archival and library and museum materials to obtain nutrients such as carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, sulfur, potassium, magnesium, iron, zinc, copper, manganese, and sometimes calcium. So basically, the same as people, I guess. And this process is what weakens and damages the surface of collection materials, the process of extracting these nutrients. Mold responses to light can vary depending upon the species. Some mold is diurnal, which means growth accelerates in the dark and slows when exposed to light. And this creates that kind of concentric circle pattern in growth that you sometimes see in mold, and you can see in the image on the screen here. Other molds actually use light to aid spore production, so it really depends on the species. And just as a note, the photo of the mold on your screen with those concentric circles is actually the ceiling of a house in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. So to quickly sum up what we've discussed so far, in general, the higher the relative humidity, the more readily mold will grow. High temperatures, stagnant air, and storage spaces which are not environmentally controlled properly all contribute to mold growth. To keep mold spores dominant, ideally temperatures should be kept below 70 degrees Fahrenheit and relative humidity should be kept at 60% or below. So now that we know what mold is and the factors which help and hinder its growth, we can move on to assessing mold in your archival, library, or museum collection. Active mold is the stuff that we really worry about, and heritage materials with a mold infestation can't be properly cleaned without making the mold inactive first. You'll recognize active mold by the fact that it's often furry or fuzzy. If you brush it with a soft brush, it will appear to smear, and it spreads rapidly. Inactive mold tends to look powdery and dry, and it's easily brushed from the surface it's on without smearing. Sometimes, though, especially if you're feeling a bit panicked about the situation or you haven't dealt with a mold outbreak before, it can be hard to tell. So I always think if you're very unsure, you want to assume that it's active just to be safe. Here are some examples of active mold on collections materials. On the left is a book covered with some fuzzy, furry, active mold. It's pretty obvious that that's an active mold outbreak right there. It's a big one. On the right is a moldy color slide. So the web-like strands that you can see kind of radiating out from the center are networks of hyphae. and that center part is the growth center. So that's where the mold begins to spread. Some mold appears as splotchy discoloration, or dark patches, which you can see in the photo on the left. This is an old ledger. On the right is a cellulose acetate negative, which exhibits very distinct sites of circular growth. And if anyone has cellulose acetate negatives in your collection, mold love them because they have everything mold could want. So if they're stored in a humid environment, they are often prone to mold growth. Pretty much any material in your collection, whether it's an archive, a library, a museum, has a potential for mold growth. This is a magnified photo on the left of a basket, and you can see the conidia pretty clearly, those spores kind of at the end of the hyphae stalks. Mold which spreads in a closed book can cause staining that looks kind of like a Rorschach blot, like those old psychological tests. There are also a lot of holes in the paper, which is another effect of a mold outbreak, particularly in a closed book. So these are areas of loss where the paper structure has become weak and deteriorated, and you can see it's happened on both sides because it's been confined between the pages. So there are some things which aren't mold, but can still give you a good scare by looking a whole lot like mold. And one of these is foxing. And foxing is that reddish-brown mold-like staining that you see on lots of old papers, lots of old books. It most likely develops from contaminants introduced where the paper was being made. Foxing has a variety of potential causes. No one's 100% sure, but it may be fungal in nature. It's not mold that we know. One way to tell is that the staining is embedded in the paper and it does not have a surface texture, so it can't be brushed away or shifted with a soft brush. Dust can look a whole lot like fluffy, furry mold. And this is a case where you want to look at the patterns the substance follows. Mold tends to be more selective than dust, in that it may follow moisture stains or fingerprints in the paper, things like that. Dust tends to be appear more as a uniform coating. It's worth noting, though, unfortunately, that mold can often be mixed with dust, so sometimes they're there together. And unfortunately, dust can also serve as a food source for mold. Dirt can resemble mold, but its distribution patterns are different. You want to be suspicious of uneven coatings of dirt and look for those thread-like hyphae, those kind of stocky, long, hairy bits under raking light. Dirt tends to have more distinct, gritty particles, whereas mold does not. Unfortunately, again, dirt and mold usually also cohabitate in the same space. So tide lines can sometimes appear to be mold. In case anyone listening doesn't know what tide lines or tide marks are, they're discolored areas which appear when a material such as paper or textile is exposed to moisture or gets wet. And the subsequent migration of dyes, dirt, or degradation products from within the textile or paper creates an area which tends to be lighter in the center and darker at the edges. I'm sure everybody's seen this in their collections. They're really common. But tide lines are not going to move if you sweep them with a soft brush. They're actually part of the paper surface, and they usually aren't raised. Mold growth patterns do sometimes follow tide lines because they were areas which were exposed to moisture. So if your tide line is furry or appears to have some sort of particulate matter attached to it, you may also have mold growth along with a tide line or tide mark. Once you determine that you do in fact have a mold outbreak, the response and recovery process should commence as soon as possible, but really only after taking the time and care to make sure that health and safety procedures are followed carefully. Some people are naturally very sensitive to mold and will know this already. And of course, these people should not go anywhere near a mold outbreak for obvious reasons. But mold sensitivities can actually develop very suddenly and can cause severe complications, including allergic reactions, asthma attacks, and inflammatory reactions in the short term. To be honest, we don't really fully understand the long-term effects of exposure to mold. People who've been through natural disasters can sometimes display delayed after effects from mold exposure, including effects on the central nervous system, things like that. I'm not telling you this to scare you at all, but just to remind you why it's best to be prepared and protected in advance, because you don't want to get sick, as well as having a mold problem. If you do not feel that you can handle being involved in a mold recovery operation for health reasons, that is a fair choice. People who have compromised immune systems or immune disorders should not enter a mold-infested area. People with diabetes or asthma and people who are taking steroids, as well as pregnant women, should not be involved in a mold recovery operation either. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, recommends levels of protection based on the size of the mold outbreak that you're dealing with. When in doubt, I think it's best to always use more protection rather than less. So if you're not sure exactly how big your mold outbreak is, just sort of plan for the worst. But minimum protection is recommended for a mold outbreak covering a surface area of 10 square feet or less. So recommended protection is, for this includes an N95 respirator, nitrile or other disposable gloves, and safety goggles or another form of eye protection. Limited protection is recommended for a mold outbreak covering the surface area of 10 to 100 square feet or less. This also includes an N95 respirator or half-face respirator with HEPA filter, disposable coveralls, gloves, and eye protection. Full protection is recommended for a mold outbreak covering a surface area of 100 square feet or less. This outfit would include gloves, disposable full body coverings such as a Tyvek suit, for example, headgear, shoe covers, and a full face respirator with a HEPA filter. Just in case anyone attending this webinar doesn't know what a HEPA filter is, it's a high efficiency particulate filter that removes 97 to 99.97% of particles down to 0.3 microns in size. And I do want to emphasize that if you are dealing with a mold outbreak that covers a large surface area, you will most likely want to get the professionals involved anyway at that point. So here are two examples of respirators. On the left, you have an N95 particulate respirator, which is disposable. And on the right, you have a half-face respirator with P100 cartridges, and they are also disposable. P refers to particulate matter, while the number next to the letter refers to the approximate percentage of particles filtered out. For example, a properly fitted respirator with a P100 filter cartridges will filter out 99.9% of particles 0.3 microns or larger. And it's also really important to get a half-face or full-face respirator properly fit tested. Industrial hygienists in your area can assist you with this, or they can direct you to someone who is trained with respirator fit testing. The American Institute of Conservation can also provide you with information on getting someone to do your respirator fit testing. But it's very important to make sure that your respirator is working efficiently. In terms of PPE, you want to look for safety goggles that are not ventilated. You don't want those mold spores getting in there. Full body Tyvek suits are necessary for very large active mold outbreaks, but also mold outbreaks in areas which may have raw sewage or other toxic and dangerous substances. You can get Tyvek suits, they're extra fancy and they have attached shoe covers and full length rubber gloves, or you can just get the basic ones with the hood. Both of them are great. Rubber or nitrile gloves are recommended anytime you come into contact with moldy material, no matter how large or small an outbreak is. So if you've had any disaster preparedness training, you know that the first thing you need to do upon discovering an emergency situation is to stabilize the area. There are stabilizing techniques which are recommended for when you first discover a mold outbreak. Step one is to locate the source of moisture or humidity. It could be a number of things, a hole in the roof, a leaky pipe, broken window, a flooded basement. It's really common for mold outbreaks to be triggered by an HVAC system issue or an HVAC system leak. You might find a very small mold outbreak on a shelf of books near an exterior wall, close to the floor, as a result of condensation. Whatever the moisture source is, you want to identify it so that it can be corrected as soon as possible. In a water emergency, you have roughly 24 to 48 hours before mold begins to grow. Once you've identified the source of moisture, you want to address it as soon as possible. If your institution has an HVAC system which can dehumidify the air, and you confirm that it is not a source of mold contamination and has not been contaminated itself, you want to turn that on. The only time you don't want to turn that on is if it's thermostatically controlled or if it's a fan coil system, because that can actually make things worse. It can start pumping out humid air. If you don't have an HVAC system, or if your HVAC system appears to be the source of the mold contamination, you just use what you've got. Open windows to get air circulating, turn fans on at low speed, and you can put portable dehumidifiers in the space. And of course, you don't want to point any fans directly at affected materials because this can just send mold spores airborne. So the third step after addressing the humidity or moisture source is to locate the affected materials. If it's a large outbreak, unaffected items can be placed in plastic bags and removed. Disposable materials should be packed in polyethylene bags, sealed and disposed of properly. In a smaller outbreak, you can actually put the moldy items themselves into plastic bags to transfer to a treatment area. You will want to avoid leaving moldy objects in a plastic bag for long periods of time because you're essentially creating a microclimate. If it's a very large outbreak, avoid moving affected materials out of the area and treat in situ if possible. Of course, if it's a very large outbreak, honestly your best course of action is to quarantine the area and get professional help. Close doors, hang plastic sheeting, and reduce air circulation from the affected area to other parts of the building to avoid mold spreading. Once you've stabilized the area, you can begin the process of inactivating and cleaning the mold. I know I keep saying this, but there are many occasions where you need to get an outside contractor involved. If you've got a medium to large scale outbreak, it's very difficult to manage yourself, unless you have a very large, well-trained, dedicated staff. Toxic strains of mold and mold combined with hazardous substances can present situations that you really can't deal with yourself. And in that case, it's imperative that you get an outside mold remediation company involved. They're trained, they've got equipment, knowledge, and they have the experience to deal with what can end up being a very dangerous situation. If you suspect that the HVAC system in your building and maybe the building itself are also moldy, the problem is likely pretty serious, and it's very important to get professional remediators involved. Very delicate, rare, or valuable materials should be taken for conservation treatment. Trying to inactivate and clean mold on delicate materials can inadvertently destroy them. And finally, if you're just completely overwhelmed, if you don't have the staff or resources to deal with something institutionally, getting contractors on site will help to manage the situation. So if you have a fairly small outbreak, there are several ways to deal with it in-house. First, you want to inactivate mold growth. You don't want to try to clean active mold because you'll just end up embedding it deeper into paper fibers, for example, and you'll spread active mold spores to other areas. Once the mold is inactive, you can begin the process of cleaning the items, which we'll talk about in just a bit. The site of the outbreak must also be thoroughly cleaned. Surfaces, floors, really any area that you suspect has come into contact with active mold needs to be cleaned before items can be returned. Really, stabilizing and cleaning moldy materials is only half the battle, because if you return them to an environment conducive to mold growth, you will very quickly end up with exactly the same problem, if not worse. The issues causing the initial outbreak must be addressed, and the environment must be very carefully controlled and monitored. And we'll talk about each of these steps in more detail as we go along. One important thing to note, the following procedures may inactivate mold growth. However, dormant mold spores will remain viable. So this means that given the right environmental circumstances, mold spores will become active again. That's why it's so important to ensure that you aren't returning objects to a mold-friendly environment, which we'll talk about. One of the most common ways to inactivate mold is to freeze moldy material. If mold has resulted from a water emergency, freezing buys you time while you figure out what your next step is. This is a solution when you have a small amount of moldy material. If you have a lot, you will need to get a remediation firm involved who will have a larger freezing facility. Although this is really convenient, not all materials respond well to being frozen. So this includes some photographic materials, case negatives, things like daguerreotypes, ambertypes, stuff like that. Paintings with thick layers of paint or varnishes sometimes do not respond well to freezing. It's really best to evaluate everything on a case-by-case basis. Fungicides and fungustats are not recommended for collections anymore. Generally speaking, if there's an outbreak of extremely toxic mold species, outside professionals may use these for HVAC systems and ductwork. However, these have not been tested for long-term effects on permanent collections materials, so you don't want to use fungicide on your important paintings. Although conservators will always tell you to avoid UV light on your objects, in the case of a mold outbreak, it can sometimes be the lesser evil. So either the sun or a UV lamp can be a good source of the UV levels necessary to inactivate and dry mold so that it can be removed physically. Because UV light can be very damaging to paper and photographic materials, it is recommended that exposure time is limited to less than 30 minutes. Desiccant drying is a service offered by vendors who pump moist or humid air out of the affected area and reintroduce dry air into the space. This is a good solution for dehydrating mold in situ so that it can actually be removed, particularly when the outbreak is fairly large. It's expensive and it may not be feasible for every institution, but it is an option. Air drying is one way to inactivate mold on materials which have gotten wet. However, it's really only for damp materials rather than wet or soaked objects. It's good for small outbreaks and for materials which cannot be frozen or desiccated. However, you do have a limited window in which to dry materials before mold becomes an issue. So you have between 24 to 48 hours. If you've been through a water emergency, you'll know that air drying takes a great deal of space, time, and manpower. If it's a case of a small outbreak on damp objects, then it's a viable option. But if it's a very large outbreak, it will be extremely difficult to actually air dry a large volume of material. But once you've inactivated the mold, yay, the next step is cleaning the inactive mold spores off of your material. So you want to make sure that you're cleaning inactive mold spores. As I've said a couple times before, but it's really important, active mold will smear, possibly become further embedded in your object, and it can spread. You don't want to clean mold, even inactive mold, off of pastels, charcoal drawings, corroded iron gall ink, or flaking paint. Basically anything which is friable, delicate, powdery, easily damaged, rare, or valuable should just be handled by a conservator. And mold removal should either be done outdoors or indoors using a fume hood with a mold trapping filter. It's really important that you don't try to clean mold inside at your desk, for example, because you'll most likely inadvertently spread it. One of the most reliable ways to remove inactivated mold is with a vacuum with a HEPA filter. Any vacuum used for mold cleanup should not be, you don't want to use a normal household vacuum, your Dyson, whatever. But aside from causing cross-contamination, a household vacuum will expel mold spores after vacuuming them. HEPA vacuums and vacuums with water bath filters are the best thing to use, so that mold spores and other matter can be contained and then disposed of. For vacuuming mold off of objects, a micro toolkit is available, which has tiny, precise parts for targeting specific areas. And a vacuum aspirator is another tool that you can use for mold remediation. Because you don't want to directly vacuum a drawing on paper, for example, one suggestion is to vacuum through a fiberglass filter so that you don't cause damage, creases, or tears on the object you're vacuuming. Another option is to use a soft brush to gently dislodge mold from the paper surface, directing it toward a small vacuum nozzle so that it can be picked up and removed. Any vacuuming should be done outside or under a fume hood with a mold filter. If you are worried that an object is too fragile to be vacuumed, it's always best to consult a conservator before beginning, of course. Another method is to use a soot sponge, or also known as chemical sponge or a dry cleaning sponge, to remove mold particles that have been inactivated. And just a note, I'm sure the person in the picture on the left would normally wear gloves, but it's best to wear gloves even when dealing with inactive mold. And you can see on the right here, that's a vacuum with a brush attachment, cleaning mold out of the gutter of that book. Once you've removed mold from the objects by inactivating it and either vacuuming it or using another method, you'll have to clean surfaces in the affected area which may be harboring mold spores. That includes floors, work surfaces, and shelves which may have come into contact with moldy materials. You will want to vacuum these surfaces with a HEPA vacuum to remove residual mold. Non-porous surfaces should be wiped with water or water with detergent. One of the most common solutions is to use 40% isopropyl alcohol, which is also known as rubbing alcohol, by volume in water. Make sure that all surfaces have a chance to dry completely before objects are returned to these spaces. Okay, moving on to mitigating future risk. This is just as important as any initial remediation measures you undertake. Going through the time, effort, and cost to remove mold from your collections is pointless if you then put them back into an environment with conditions which will cause the same mold growth and degradation to occur. Mitigating the risk of a future mold outbreak requires a coordinated effort from the entire institution and includes planning and policy, establishing a segregated or quarantine area, consistent HVAC and building maintenance, proper storage, regular housekeeping, and maintaining appropriate environmental parameters. These are all important parts for preventing the reoccurrence of a mold outbreak in collections. Establishing the necessary policies to control risk is very important and pretty basic. These policies include a solid emergency preparedness and response plan, which has provisions for dealing with fire, water, and other natural disasters, as well as a mold recovery plan. Ideally, your institution should have procedures in place for handling an incoming object suspected of mold infestation. Having a segregation and quarantine plan is also important for dealing with pest infestations, so it's a good idea to have for lots of reasons. Maintenance and housekeeping plans will support a regular schedule of cleaning, inspecting, and building maintenance. Excuse me. And environmental monitoring plans will help direct a targeted approach to ensuring that the environment and areas collections are exhibited or stored are carefully monitored so that the environment is kept within recommended parameters to prohibit mold growth or activation. Sorry for my creaky voice. Samantha said maybe there's mold spores in my throat, which I don't want to think about. Regular inspection and cleaning of the HVAC system, including frequent changing of filters, is necessary to prevent and avoid mold occurring in a system which can distribute it throughout the building. It's really important to perform regular maintenance, and as basic as it is, checking out trouble areas regularly to ensure that they don't develop into a larger issue. You also want to ensure good air circulation throughout the building and avoid pockets of stagnant air where mold can begin to grow. Regular dusting, keeping collections materials in boxes and enclosures when possible, vacuuming floors instead of just sweeping up the floors are all fairly simple tasks which will make a huge difference in keeping your collections mold-free. Another important aspect of regular housekeeping is that it allows you to spend time checking on areas of the collection and looking at materials you might otherwise not get a chance to examine. And obviously keeping collection areas free of food, drink, and plants is important, as these things can all contribute to a mold outbreak. Finally, one of the most crucial steps to avoiding another mold outbreak is to control and monitor the environment. Ideally, you will want to keep humidity below 55%, 55 to 60%, and you'll want to keep temperature below 70 degrees Fahrenheit to ensure that mold is not reactivated. In order to make sure that you're carrying out an effective program of environmental control, you want to regularly monitor and record data, preferably by using an independent data logger. Even if you've got an HVAC system which monitors and records temperature and relative humidity, it's really important to have a separate independent device to monitor the environment. HVAC system data is great, but a data logger will help you to confirm that this data is correct. It'll help you catch any HVAC failures or inconsistencies, which can occur. And data loggers are also good at helping to monitor pockets of storage, which you might know to be problematic. For example, if you've had a mold outbreak in a very specific area of storage and you aren't sure why, as you're getting an appropriate environmental reading for the rest of the storage room, installing a data logger in the space and monitoring that data will let you know if you're dealing with stagnant air, condensation, or some other issue which might make the environment conducive to mold growth. And finally, proper storage is very important. Avoid storing collections in damp basements when possible. Store collections at least 4 to 6 inches off of the floor. Avoid storage areas with past leaks or poorly insulated exterior walls. Anywhere which has a tendency to be the site of condensation is going to be problematic for mold growth as well. If your institution has compact shelving, you may want to occasionally leave gaps in the shelving to prevent the formation of pockets of stagnant air and to let air circulate in between stacks. So we're almost done. I just wanted to point you toward 5 resources that I've uploaded with this webinar. The CCHA Guide to Managing a Mold Invasion, NEDCC's Guide to the Emergency Salvage of Moldy Books and Paper, NHR's Post-Flood Health and Safety Sheet, a vacuum fact sheet for choosing and using a vacuum in heritage collections, and a glossary of basic mold terminology. 3 additional resources I'd like to point you to include the EPA's Guide to Mold, which is really good, and AIC's Find a Conservator tool. This is a search engine that lets you identify the geographic area and type of material that you're looking to have treated, and it comes up with a list of conservators within these parameters. It's a really good place to start if you need a conservator to evaluate your collections and when you're dealing with a mold outbreak or for any other reason. And finally, I very much recommend Fungal Facts Solving Fungal Problems in Heritage Collections by Mary Lou Florian. And it is an incredibly comprehensive look at mold in heritage collections, and it is a great book to have on hand, particularly if you do have a collection which is prone to mold. So at this point, I am happy to take any questions that you might have about mold, about the program. Samantha can answer those. Anything yet? Let's see. So,
just highlight the file and then hit download.
If you're having trouble extracting the CCHA and NHR files, if you can highlight it and it should download. If you want to email, we can actually send those to you directly, Cynthia. Yeah, it's not a problem. If you email Samantha, we can get those sent to you. Any moldy questions? This is a good question. Is there a recommended amount of time to quarantine mold suspect materials? I would recommend if you think that you have an active mold outbreak, if you can put it in the freezer, that's probably the best thing to do. I mean, there isn't really a recommended amount of time to quarantine things like that. You just want to quarantine it until you can verify that either it's moldy or not moldy, and then proceed from there. And that can be as soon as a day, it can be, depends how fast that mold is growing. That's a really good question, though. Sarah asks, is an old book smell indicative of mold, or can it be caused by something else? That is a very good smell. A good smell, sorry, good question. It's not a good smell. That smell, that old book smell is generally actually kind of an acidic smell. That's it's the sort of the breakdown of lignin in that kind of cheap wood pulp paper. That's usually what you're smelling. It can be other things. Sometimes it can be mold. If you do smell mold in a collection, you know, it's important to check it out and see if you can find some sort of outbreak, either in the building, in the room itself, or in the shelves. But usually that old book smell is more of like a vinegar kind of smell. It's more of a paper degradation smell. Any other mold related questions? Well, if anything comes up, you can feel free to email Samantha and she will answer those for you. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Yeah. All right. Have a great day. Try not to think about mold. Oh, if you put if you put shrimp in a Jello mold, does it count as an appetizer or dessert? I think that counts as hazardous material that should be disposed of. And I believe there will be a copy of it.
It's being recorded.
Okay, the presentation is being recorded, and that will it be emailed out or sent?
Be available on the website.
It will be available on the website. So the presentation and all the files will be there. Thanks, everybody.